So here's another example. Joe sold 180 newspapers out of 200. Bill sold 85% of his 260 papers. Ron sold 212 newspapers, which was 80% of the number of papers he started with. A, who sold the most newspapers and how many did they sell? And B, who sold the greatest percentage of newspapers and what was the percent? So what we're doing is we're given three different individuals and we are comparing who sold the most papers, who sold the greatest percentage of newspapers. So I think the easiest way to think about this is to break down three separate problems and then compare them all at the end. So let's just look at Joe first. So Joe sold 180 newspapers out of 200. Joe sold 180 newspapers out of 200. Well, this one's really easy to get a percent because if I divide this, that'll give me the decimal version. 180 divided by 200 gives me 0.9. And in a percent, move the decimal 2 spots to the right, 90%. Okay, so Joe sold, let's write this. He sold 180. That was given to me in the problem. He sold 180 papers. And that was 90% of his papers. Okay, so now let's look at Bill. Bill sold 85% of his 260 papers. Okay, so we're going to compare his, but before we can compare it, we know Bill's percent. Bill sold 85%, but we don't know how many papers he sold. We just know that he sold 85% of his 260 papers. So we're going to have to set up a proportion for Bill. Bill sold 85% of 260 papers. The is I don't know. I don't know how many papers he sold. X over of, which is 260, equals percent, 85 over 100. I'm going to cross multiply. 100x equals 85 times 260 is going to give me 22,100. I'm going to divide by 100 and get X is 221 papers. Okay, so Bill sold 221 papers, which was 85%. Because remember, this is what I'm trying to compare. And then the last guy, Ron, sold 212 papers, which was 80% of the number of papers he started with. So I've got Ron sold 212 newspapers, which was 80% of the papers he started with. Well, thankfully, they did all that math for me. How many papers did Ron sell? Ron sold 212 papers, which was 80%. Thankfully, I don't have to do any math for that one. Now, I need to answer the question, who sold the most papers and how many? Well, if I'm comparing Joe sold 180, Bill sold 220, Ron sold 212, so Bill sold the most papers. And how many did he sell? He sold 221 papers in whatever this time frame was. Who sold the greatest percent of newspapers? Well, for whatever reason, they didn't all start with the same amount of papers. And the biggest percent would be Joe sold Not the most papers, but he sold the most percent of his papers. And so Joe sold the greatest percent. He sold 90% of his papers. All right, and then I want you to take a look at example 6. Now, I would say pause the video, try and work it out yourself, and then compare with mine. Now, together, I want us to go through and do example 5, a percent decrease. No shock that when you buy a house or buy a car that it can devalue or upvalue. So things like cars, they devalue to a point, and then when they become an antique, they start gaining value. So here's our example. Mort bought his house in 2006 for $359,000. It was recently appraised at $195,000. What is the approximate percent of decrease in value to the nearest percent? So unfortunately for Mort, his house has really decreased. I don't know what happened, if it flooded, if he had renters that destroyed the place, but for whatever reason, in 2006, it was $359,000, and now, we'll say today, it is $195,000. So what we need to do is set up a proportion to find the percent decrease. The first part with percent decrease is that I need to find the change. So it originally was original minus current. It originally was $359,000 minus the current value, $195,000. And when I subtract those, I get $164,000. So that's the change in the house value. Now I can find the percent of change. Because I found the change, now I need to find the percent of that. So I'm going to have that $164,000 over the original, which the original was $359,000 equals percent over 100. Now we don't know the percent, that's what we're looking for. So I can just call that X. I'm going to cross multiply. 359,000 X equals a whole bunch of zeros. That number. Divide both sides by 359,000. 359,000. Running out of room. And I've got X equals 46.58%. But notice in the question it says, what is the approximate percent of decrease in value to the nearest percent? So rounded to the nearest percent, that would be 47%. You can also see over here to the right, I have another common formula that you'll see. We did the same thing, we just did it in a couple different steps. So either way will work. I choose to go through the proportion because that's how we're doing the rest of the section. But you also can do percent increase or decrease with that formula over to the right.